Welcome, everybody. We are delighted to have you with us this afternoon for a very important conversation on helping kids and families cope in uncertain times. We are also very honored to have with us Dr. David Anderson from the Child Mind Institute, and he is back by popular demand. His organization is helping schools and families and kids all around the world, and very specifically in California, which he might touch on a little bit later. Today, we are offering simultaneous Spanish interpretation. So if you would like to hear this program in Spanish, Cynthia Hinestrosa is with us. You can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then Spanish. So the globe icon in Spanish to hear this in Espanol. All right, again, we are very happy to be here, and we would not be here without the generous funding from Sequoia Healthcare District, Sequoia Union High School District, Peninsula Healthcare District, and this organization, the nonprofit. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of the Parent Venture and the Parent Education Series, this program now in its 16th year. Today's format is going to follow a typical webinar. That is, Dr. Anderson will be speaking to us for about 45 minutes, and then we really want to hear from you, the audience. There's two ways for you to interact with us today. First of all, there's the chat button. My co-founder, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links in the chat, and please put questions in the Q&A. So resources, you can talk to one another in the chat, and then questions in the Q&A. We will have about 15 minutes at the end of this program to answer your questions, of which I know there will be many. I want to say that today's event is being recorded and will be available on our video library. So do look for that. And at the end, you'll see a link to a very short survey, like 4 questions. We hope you will take a minute to fill that out. It helps us with our funders and to plan for future programming. All right, let me tell you a little bit about today's featured presenter. Dave Anderson, PhD, is a clinical psychologist and vice president of school and community programs at the Child Mind Institute. Dr. Anderson was formerly the senior director of Child Mind Institute's ADHD and Behavior Disorders Clinic, and he specializes in evaluating and treating children and adolescents with ADHD, behavior, anxiety, and mood disorders. He lectures frequently and leads workshops for parents, educators, and policymakers, and he's contributed to national media organizations, including ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and NPR, just to name a few. Examples of Dr. Anderson's work can be found on the Child Mind website. Bev will be putting that link in the chat, as well as the recently launched California Healthy Minds Thriving Kids Project. He earned his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and his doctorate in clinical psychology from Columbia University. Please join me in a really warm welcome for Dr. Dave Anderson. Take it away, Dave.
Thank you. And Bev, you've been really active during Charlene's wonderful introduction in the chat in throwing out the Child Mind Institute's website and letting people know that they can click on different languages to ensure that they're hearing the presentation here. So I'm going to begin by sharing some slides and getting to what I will reference for today's seminar here. So again, I'm Dave Anderson. I'm a clinical psychologist and the vice president of school and community programs at the Child Mind Institute. That's not long. So this is the Child Mind Institute, as Charlene so wonderfully said. Our website is childmind.org. Bev has also put it in the chat. We provide clinical care in both New York and San Francisco. The way we do that is we have clinics in our home offices in New York and San Francisco, and we also have a school and community programs team of clinicians, the department that I run. They provide direct services within New York City DOE schools, within school districts in the San Francisco Bay Area. We also have public education as one of the main pillars of our work. This includes our website, childmind.org, which has hundreds of articles for caregivers and for educators, and also public education campaigns like Charlene mentioned, like the Healthy Minds Thriving Kids Project, which was funded by the governor and first partner of California, and can be found at childmind.org/healthyminds, which I'll also be talking about sort of at the end of this presentation. And then we also do research. We look for objective markers of mental health and learning disorders in children and adolescents. And we also seek to share openly all of the data we collect through our research so that breakthroughs can be made in work around analysis of brain-based data for children and adolescents, as well as the use of apps and technology in treatment. So going to the topic today, talking about coping in uncertain times. So this talk in general has evolved over the course of COVID in the sense that each one is framed by kind of where we are in the midst of the pandemic, the post-vaccine world, the sort of attempts to return to semblance of normalcy. And then what we focus on is in the context of wherever we are in the changing world we've seen over the last 2 years, figuring out how to help families to find a sort of bedrock or something that they can hang their hat on, where no matter how uncertain the world is around them, we can create a wellness promoting home environment, and we can help families to think about how to practice coping skills for themselves and for their children or teens to be able to cope with any challenges that they might face in the currently evolving world. And of course, I'll leave some time at the end for questions. They can be related to the material in the presentation, or they can be tangentially related to something you were hoping I might get to in this presentation and hoping maybe I'll speak to. So in terms of the challenges, impact, and ongoing uncertainty of COVID. So when I frame these things, and just as a preview for those of you just joining us, the next couple slides are going to be a little bit of a downer, because the reality is that a lot of the talk about COVID and children and adolescents has tended to focus on topics that are not necessarily the main drivers of stress during the pandemic, but have been the majorly politicized ones, in the sense that we've talked a lot during the pandemic about the role of schools and whether or not kids should be in school or can possibly be educated online, and learning loss. And granted, that is a particular stress, and we'll talk about that. Masks, which are not a particularly huge source of stress or driving a lot of the mental health effects of the pandemic, but are highly politicized. And then at the same time, just kind of thoughts about how our country deals with the ongoing pandemic and what sorts of measures we take to stop spread, when in reality, the pandemic has been having significant effects in every area of this country and every area of the world. So just to look at the kind of impact of COVID on child and teen well-being, even before COVID, 1 in 5 children under 17 had a mental health and learning disorder, will have it by the time they reach the end of adolescence. What we know is that the data was already not good in terms of getting kids the support they need. Even when parents know that something might be going wrong with their child, the research shows that most parents, due to stigma or not wanting to pathologize their child, or a general kind of fear that seeing a mental health professional will kind of lock them in to needing services forever, many parents will wait anywhere from 2 to 6 years from the time they know something might be wrong to the time they seek help from a professional. When we ask the same question of parents about waiting to see the pediatrician, the answer might be calling the pediatrician on the same day. And we really wanted to change that even before the pandemic started. Even beyond that, when kids did seek treatment, many did not have it covered by their insurance. About half don't even receive treatment for a mental health learning disorder in general. And then at the same time, when people do find treatment, it's often not linked scientifically to the particular condition that we're trying to treat. As the pandemic began, we saw pretty massive devastation the first 6 months in relation to the effects of not only the death and the kind of loss that was seen as a result of the pandemic, but at the same time, some of the financial devastation, the ways that put stress on families. So to be sure, the COVID pandemic, we do not describe colloquially as a trauma. The COVID pandemic itself could facilitate trauma in the sense that it's a universal stressor that led to acute traumatic events for some. At the same time, for some kids, it led to a higher accumulation of adverse life experiences, maybe not something that we would normally think of as an acute trauma, like living through a natural disaster or a death, but at the same time was a stressor that wears on mental health in general. And we've seen worsening trends, particularly in the populations that experienced these kinds of stressors during the pandemic, but worsening trends in the general population overall. So we saw folks during the pandemic, especially in the early stages, experienced loss of housing, financial insecurity, nights when they or their children had to go hungry, or where they found themselves without a home. In terms of the death and devastation, I mean, to this day, we're still seeing it. 63,000 people still died of COVID last month. We've seen over 1 million people lose their lives. It's estimated that 9 million people in this country have a close family member they've lost to COVID, and over 150,000 children have lost a caregiver to COVID, a primary parent. So there's a sector of the population that's experienced acute trauma. There's a sector of the population that's experienced prolonged stress, financially, social isolation, which is a stressor that has been written about a lot in the research on teenagers and their experience of the pandemic, and what happened as a result of lockdown or virtual schooling, or trying to make sure you stayed safe for vulnerable family members. We've seen research on learning loss in the sense that we now know for a fact that while virtual learning can be a substitute for many things and can be effective, there is a value, especially for young kids, to being in person in school and ensuring that we can pay the right attention to the advancements they're making in their learning. And we've seen increases in family conflict, increased reports of domestic violence as a result of the kind of stress that families are experiencing, and arguments and conflict that can have a real effect on many family members' mental health. When we look at the statistics over the course of the pandemic, they're troubling. Reports of anxiety and depression symptoms have nearly doubled during the pandemic. And while some indicators have returned, at least at this phase, to some of their pre-pandemic norms, we're still seeing, partly because of a lack of access to mental health services in this country, increases in hospitalizations, increases in teens, suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And these are troubling. There need to be solutions that go beyond kind of a return to normal. And for those of you who've heard kind of references to this, it's really important for us not to describe a sort of post-COVID world as a return to normal. The pandemic has spent 2 years reordering priorities, the way that we work, the way that we attend school, and the way that our families function in the world. So to say that we're returning to normal is sort of missing the point. In many ways, we are rebuilding and reconstructing things, understanding what the pandemic helped us to look at as the valuable kind of drivers of stress and wellness within life. The last thing I'll just say about the effects of the pandemic is that there's been a disproportionate impact for the factors that I've just listed on low SES families and communities of color. So in terms of the ways that this stress has increased, we know that the critical kind of stressors that I just talked about have driven a lot of the increase in stress during the pandemic. As I've already referenced, availability and access to mental health care has really driven that kind of stress. Some things that we've become more aware of, especially with new and really robust research in this area in the last 5 years, are that some of the drivers of stress and trauma within this country are related to racism and income inequality and climate change and gun violence. And we're learning much more about kind of the overlap in the way that mental health is kind of a mutually reinforcing system with those sources of stress. And then beyond that, what I think a lot of parents have heard a lot about, especially in the media, is social media and its effects, which to be sure is something that can exacerbate mental health symptoms for vulnerable youth populations, and it's something we should pay attention to. But what's important to also remember about social media is that it pales in comparison to almost all the factors I've just listed in terms of sources of stress and the drivers of worsening mental health in children and adolescents. So when we talk about the path forward, and that's what we're talking about today, what the pandemic has done in many ways in mental health is that it has slowed down the world to a reflective place to some degree. It's helped to break down stigma in talking about mental health and learning disorders. It's helped us to think about the fact that we have all had to pay attention to our mental health and our wellness during the pandemic. And rather than thinking of something as a return to normal, because honestly, normal for mental health pre-pandemic was bad. So we want to think about how can we consciously build the structures within families, within schools, and within society that will help to support kids and adolescents into a healthier and more well future. So in kind of recognition of where we are right now and the importance of this, most major psychiatric associations got together this past fall and declared a crisis in child and mental health that requires our attention. And the US Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, also issued an advisory looking at what families, communities, and schools can do to improve the situation around child and adolescent mental health in this country. And just as kind of a preview, I'll just throw this out there because the US Surgeon General's mental health advisory, the Child Mind Institute and I and members of my team contributed to, and it's really good. It breaks down really complex concepts very straightforwardly and includes graphics like the one I'm showing on this screen, where you can really, these are basically posters to begin with that we could hang in schools and homes to say, okay, if we're looking to support child and adolescent mental health, here are the ways we can think systemically to make sure that we're doing the right things. Now, moving from the systemic to the level of the family. So you're looking at kind of the Surgeon General's graphic here. In the sense there is lots that we can do as a society in constructing environments for kids and adolescents, as communities, as families, and for the individual to help with mental health and to support kids through stress and uncertain times. But what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this talk, and really for the next 32 minutes or so, is what one can do at the family level, specifically as a caregiver to children and teens, in terms of helping them to cope and helping them to have the mental health skills to address challenging situations. So first thing is, if you're trying to establish a wellness promoting home environment, these are some of the major principles that we draw from the research that are key and that we bring people back to time and time again. So frequently we'll have sessions or we'll give talks where folks generally will think there's something new under the sun that we're meant to discover on wellness. And the fact is that, what we return to are old standards, even with the stressors the pandemic has thrown to us. So for many of us, both during the pandemic and now in this phase, establishing routines is a huge focus, making sure that we have consistency. And I'll talk on the next slide about what those routines can look like and why they're so important to establishing wellness. And it's mainly around the space we make for certain wellness behaviors. And I'll talk about that in a second. It's building in quality one-to-one time. I don't necessarily have another slide to break this out, but it's more that if we're trying to think about wellness promotion within a family, we have to actually make space. And this can be on the level, and research has shown that this is effective, of 5 minutes with a child or a teenager per day. But there are specific stipulations about what quality time is. Quality time is not getting things done that are on a to-do list. It tends to be in a mutually enjoyable situation where your focus is merely on relating to each other and having a shared experience, keeping lines of communication open. You're not necessarily setting an agenda, and making sure that you're not, saying, by the way, let me remind you of these other 8 things that you need to do. And I'll talk about a couple of those guidelines in a couple slides. The next thing about promoting a wellness environment, whether it is something where you're trying to promote your partner's wellness, or you're trying to promote your child or adolescent's wellness, or you're trying to promote your coworkers' wellness, or people who report to you at work, reality is that people only can imitate what they see. So it's very hard when you have somebody who is preaching the right notes around wellness or around promoting mental health, but at the same time is not living it themselves. So one of the ways I've built out these slides over the next 30 minutes is that every single one of these skills is something that we can promote for children and adolescents, but we should also be practicing ourselves. And if we're not doing that, if we're not experientially living it, it becomes really tough to either A, tell someone else about their value and convince them to try them, and B, understand what experiences one should be getting or one should be observing in others around them if you're engaged in these sorts of behaviors and trying to cope with stress. The last thing I'll throw out there, which is related to the kind of the second group of slides that I'm going to show, is that building basic components of social emotional literacy at home, certain mental health skills, are extremely important in terms of setting attainable goals and finding ways to build these skills incrementally over time, because they're not built overnight. Much of what I'm going to discuss today is something that is conceptually really easy to wrap our heads around, but is so difficult in practice. And that is very true for most humans. So in thinking about routines, and I think, Noreen, I see that you've raised your hand, but I'm going to take questions at the end, starting around 3:40 or 12:45 here, Pacific time, 3:45 if you're on the East Coast. Just going to routines, and Sarita, I see you raising your hand as well. Just you can put it in the Q&A section or in the chat. When we're talking about routines at home, what we're looking to do is establish routines around wellness habits. So what this means is sleep, exercise, diet and hydration, and engagement in extracurricular activities. And then one of the things we've added in recent years is around routines around screen time. If families are able to set up routines around these major wellness behaviors, you generally see the wellness of all family members increase. So in that sense, if we can establish predictability for morning routines, getting the kids or the teens out of the house for school, and evening routines, powering down for sleep and engaging in good hygiene, you generally improve the wellness of almost all humans. If we can set a sleep schedule, so I've highlighted sleep schedule here, but even on childmind.org, we have other articles about sleep hygiene and how to set up good preparation for sleep behaviors. But what we're looking at is something where if you're trying to work on your own wellness, really looking at the number of hours that are recommended per night. And these are not necessarily so hard and fast that you must adhere to them. I have a kid who is of school age, who gets about 10 hours of sleep a night, and a preschooler who also gets 10 hours of sleep a night and is at the lower end of the range, sometimes a little bit less than that. But the reality is sometimes you're in families that sleep a little bit less, sometimes you're in families that sleep a little bit more, but the focus should be on how do we get people good sleep at night, and how do we make it so that their morning routine gets them ready for the day in a wellness promoting way? How do we make it so their nighttime routine really powers them down for sleep in a way that's developmentally appropriate? We have a number of articles about this. The next thing about routines for wellness is encouraging physical activity. And this doesn't necessarily mean your child has to do sports. Many children and teenagers don't do sports. It's more just that what we're trying to get people to do is move their bodies in some way. This can be yoga, it can be taking a walk, it could be just generally being outside. It can be deciding that you're just going to try to hit a steps goal for the day. It can be engaged even in video games that promote physical activity where you're moving and trying to control a character on the screen, but it's moving your body. It's not being sedentary throughout the entire day. We try to set up routines where people can predictably know kind of where their food is coming from and how they can keep their diet balanced in a way that they would like, or at least trying to keep their diet as healthy as they can. We want to make sure that people really are making time to stay hydrated. I can't tell you how often this is something where we get somebody to start thinking about hydrating themselves throughout the day and they suddenly report they feel physically better. We try to think about unstructured activities. So a lot of times with busy families of today, wellness promotion entails knowing that your child is engaged in certain activities they're passionate about or that they like, or extracurriculars that require physical activity or get them kind of out of the house, but also making sure that there is unstructured time. And that unstructured time doesn't necessarily mean that it's non-screen time. I'll just throw that out there. Many parents will say, look, I don't know what to do with that time. If they're just at home and it's unstructured and they don't have homework, not all screen time is created equal. It's actually very different, for example, if a teenager is in their room on social media alone, than it might be, for example, in the research for them to be in a public area of the house, watching a show where you might be able to sit down with them and share that particular experience. And then the last thing that we highlight, and we have lots of articles on childmind.org, as well as partners like Common Sense Media and others around screen time, or a partner of ours at UCLA, Yalda Ulls, who has a book called Media Moms, Digital Dads, that goes into a lot of the rules that we reference that are research-based around screen time, but it's setting those kinds of routines and being able to say, here is the time we're going to stop screens in order to power down for bed and have alternative activities that we might be able to engage in. Here are the rules for content that we think make it so that it's developmentally appropriate. And here's how we're going to kind of oversee those things. Here's how much time you might get on a weekday or a weekend. And then here are the moments where we as a family are going to agree that we're all going to put our screens away, meaning that the caregivers don't even have their phones on them during these moments. Again, all of this has generally been shown in the research to increase wellness across families. In terms of relationships, and going back to that mention that I made of quality one-on-one time, it's finding small moments throughout the day to offer acknowledgement and affirmation to the people in your family. And it's not contingent on behavior. It's about your enjoyment of being present with them. And this can often be very tough, particularly with adolescents who might be displaying a good bit of attitude. What we tell parents is to find 3 moments during the day where perhaps it's been at least the best attitude you've seen. And all you're trying to do is express that you enjoyed that moment, or was nice to talk, or that you were thinking of them in some way. Another thing that in general is helpful in promoting wellness is figuring out how you can recognize interests in the family non-judgmentally. What that means is that if your child or teenager is engaged in activity, you're sitting down next to them, and all you're trying to do is show interest in that activity, and in general describe, kind of like a play-by-play announcer, what you're seeing or what you're seeing them doing. Maybe even give some positive feedback if you see them doing something that is skill-based. And incredibly, and this is something that's obvious when I say it, but most of us don't do it, particularly with those in our family. If you want to bond with someone and increase the sense that being around you is promoting of their wellness, avoiding asking questions, making critical comments, or giving reminders is a huge way to increase the quality of that time and make it so that when you do have to ask questions later, or make critical comments, or give reminders, someone's more willing to listen because they feel like you came at them without an agenda and it wasn't necessarily all about what you needed from them in that moment or the information you needed. It's true of couples, it's true of children, it's true of teenagers. If you are trying to get closer to your partner, spend some time, don't ask them a question, don't criticize them, and don't give them reminders about what they have to do or what you both have to do. You just expressed interest and try to stay present in the enjoyment. And lastly, for kids and adolescents, in terms of improving wellness, letting them know that you're attempting to keep an open channel of communication and that you're available to listen if they're struggling is a huge thing. And this just means finding your way of saying it over and over. It's ending interactions, any interaction that might be tender, any interaction where you might have bonded, any interaction where you might have had mutual enjoyment, and saying to a kid, by the way, I just want you to know, I'm here if we need to talk. Or hey, if you're having a hard time later this week, let's chat, let's take a moment and let's just kind of sit down and maybe we'll talk over a snack or something. And it's those kinds of things that let people know you're there without contingencies. The last thing I'll throw out there about creating a wellness promoting home environment is that in addition to thinking about the routines you have at home around sleep, eating, hydration, exercise, and screens, and thinking about how you can create this kind of non-contingent quality time that you might be spending as family members, the last thing is to think about your own modeling of adaptive coping skills. And that means that the skills I'm about to go through over the next 18 minutes are incredibly important for you to demonstrate that you're doing for your children. I'll talk about how to do that. And then at the same time, it's being able to kind of like self-narrate about how you're doing it. So in other words, if you're around family members, talking aloud about how you're keeping yourself regulated, you're having a stressful moment and you're trying to solve a particular problem, even in 2 or 3 sentences, can really model for someone how you'd like them to deal with that problem should they encounter it, in the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in 2 slides, but helping people to be able to identify and manage their emotions is massively important in terms of promoting wellness within the home. So I'll talk about that skill here. So outside of kind of setting the stage for success and promoting this sort of wellness environment at home, these are the major skills that we try to get families to start practicing. And just to preview this, because I know I go quickly, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to include links to our childmind.org/healthyminds, as in Healthy Minds Thriving Kids Project curriculum, which includes 34 videos, and there's 5 for each age range and language, and they're in English and Spanish. There are 5 instructional videos related to the skills I'm about to outline, and then there's skill sheets for at-home practice that go along with each of these, and it provides kind of more that you can build on and follow through with regarding implementation to the skills that I might just preview right here. So in terms of what we try to get families practicing, in terms of coping skills at home, what we try to think about is at first, it's that these skills are establishing a foundation for talking about and normalizing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. These are the big 3. How you feel, how you think about things when you're having feelings, and then how you behave when you're having feelings. And that's what these skills are focused on, is giving larger amounts of insight around that, and then giving you more things that you might be able to do in stressful situations about those 3 things. It's helping to make sure that kids have opportunities to practice in situations where they might need to regulate their emotion. And it provides a framework for how you can choose to think and act in the moment, rather than thinking that these things are just something you don't have control over and they're just a program that just runs to completion without being able to kind of insert different pathways into it. So what we think about with the skills I'm about to review is that whatever you might be practicing at home, you're just trying to work it in small and incremental ways. And I used to put this slide at the end, but now I put it at the front because I find that if I present all the skills, people start to think, oh my gosh, I have to be doing all of this. And the reality is you just start with one. So in the next few slides that I go through, think about which 1 or 2 skills you might start practicing, and then to come back to the recording of this presentation, or go back to the resources I'm linking to at the end as ways of building in other skills within your family. But this can look like starting from this presentation with practicing mindfulness exercises during your family morning routine. Or it can be that when you're reading or watching a television program, you're discussing and validating the characters' thoughts and emotions, or trying to talk about why they're doing what they're doing and whether or not that was helpful or unhelpful. It might mean that you're trying to engage in some sort of paced breathing ritual of some kind before a stressful moment that you might encounter, or before, for example, the one that I see this most with paced breathing is before sporting matches or performances that kids might engage in. It's trying to come up with a particular wellness goal of the week that you practice as a family, and maybe even reward yourselves as a family if you actually accomplish that particular goal. It's providing time for self-reflection. If you have an artistic family that likes either drawing or painting or trying to express themselves through art. This is something that, if you value it as a family, can provide a means of coping effectively and thinking about stressors that you all might be encountering. And then finally, it's making sure that if you're looking at certain skills, it's scheduling time to practice those skills, like play dates or social gatherings with kids, and then noticing when they've actually practiced some of these skills in challenging situations with peers. So the general building blocks of wellness at home are helping kids to identify their feelings, making sure they have some method of relaxation sometimes in stressful situations, which often goes back to breathing, helping kids to realize their thoughts are malleable and can be changed in the moment to interpret situations and lead to perhaps different emotional experiences, getting kids to ride the wave of big emotions. So oftentimes we're experiencing really intense emotions, either as kids or teenagers. There may not be a lot we can do to change them. Like in this case, relaxation skills are often thought of as calming. Maybe you can't get calm. Managing thoughts or thinking about maybe you're changing your interpretation to lead to different emotions, that may not always be possible. So what we don't want to do is convince kids that in every situation you're going to be able to get yourself calm, or that it's adults' responsibility to eliminate the negative emotions they're experiencing. Sometimes you're just riding it out. And that's why we have distress tolerance skills within managing big emotions. If you're feeling down, or if you're not doing so well, activity scheduling is the main skill we focus on. And then finally, it's trying to build in mindful practices that have been shown to be linked to higher feelings of joy, positive emotions, and gratitude within families when you engage in mindfulness. So, breaking down each of these skills. If we're trying to teach kids to understand feelings, what we're looking for is for adults to identify and label the emotions they're feeling in a certain situation. This can be simple on the level of like the movie Inside Out. I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm angry, I am feeling disgust and I'm grossed out, or I am scared. It can be that, but then almost every other emotion word that we have is in one of those categories and is something that helps kids to build out kind of the nuances of their emotional experience. So being able to label your own emotions for kids, or being able to highlight the moments when they're stressed and being able to say, I want to listen to how you're feeling right now. What's important is that there's a balance in this, in that we want kids to be able to identify their emotions. We don't need to necessarily get extremely overindulgent. Like we don't need to have a really involved conversation at any moment about that particular feeling. It's more just that for someone to take a moment to check in with themselves and know how they're feeling, that can often give them a chance to say, wait a second, should I do something different right now? Is there something that could help me to resolve this situation better than the way that I'm kind of emotional reasoning right now? The other reason why we have people identify their feelings is that we want them to understand some core things about emotions. A, it is very possible to experience more than one emotion at the same time. So in other words, a child can love a caregiver and at the same time be extremely angry at them. That's common. We often use books like Double Dip Feelings and things like that to highlight the fact that you're not just feeling one thing oftentimes. That also helps kids, by the way, for any of you who might be dealing with a child or a teenager who's grieving. Grief is a very multifaceted process. People are often surprised that it's not just sadness, but that it entails the entire emotional spectrum. And that helps us to kind of realize we're going to be feeling a lot of different things at the same time. We want kids and teenagers to understand they experience emotions at different intensities. So the joy of scoring a goal in soccer or finishing a piano performance may be high intensity, in the same way that fear of like a social situation might also be high intensity for some people and low intensity for others. We want kids to also link to physical sensations. So to understand that when they feel feelings, it's not always just a head thing, like they're labeling how they're feeling, but that many people experience very different kind of physical sensations in their bodies when feeling specific emotions, which is why I have a picture here of a body, because we often, tell kids, show me where you feel this particular feeling in your body. And we're surprised at the fact that a kid will feel it in, places that maybe we don't feel it ourselves. The last thing that I'll talk about understanding feelings that we really think about for kids is trying to get kids to link how they're feeling at any particular point in the day with what's happening in their life, who they're around, what situation they're in, and to realize that they're more in control of the intensity of those feelings related to those situations than they think. So even if they feel badly toward another person, or they don't feel like another person is justified in their opinion of them, they can to some degree change the level of stress they feel in those situations by noticing they're feeling that way and then applying some of the skills on subsequent slides here. So again, the way that we kind of do this with kids is that if they notice a feeling, we try to give positive feedback. We'll usually try to utilize some sort of scale where we say, can you rate the feeling on this level? And the reason why we have joy, fear, disgust, sadness, and anger here all at once is that we are not just saying to a kid, how stressed are you, rated on a scale of 1 to 10. We're saying, look, tell me how you are on the sadness scale. Are you also feeling a little bit of fear? Or are you also feeling a little bit of joy? And that helps to drive home the idea that you can feel multiple emotions at the same time. And encouraging discussions about this. Families who display something like this, or a mood meter, or a feelings chart somewhere in their home, particularly starting when kids are young, can really promote the idea that discussing emotions can be a very valid family discussion. The next thing we focus on is relaxation skills. So it's this idea that we all have these moments when we're stressed, and it's good to have your own practice of something that can help you to maybe turn down the intensity of emotions. It won't always. Like, for example, I was talking to a recent patient after a breakup, and the reality is you're just going to feel intensely after a breakup. There may not be a way to turn down the intensity fully, but if you do breathing exercises or progressive muscle relaxation or some sort of guided imagery, there may be moments where you can turn down your intensity in that moment, help you get to sleep, help you to relax, help you to feel hunger in that moment when you're feeling all these strong emotions. So a lot of the kind of instructional content that we give kids is centered around trying to help them to connect to the experience of breathing and understanding that increasing the amount of oxygen they're getting can also help to calm down the intensity of emotions. And this is true for every human. Adults are often astounded at how simply this intervention helps them. And to reference the curriculum that I'm going to throw out there at the end of the presentation today, Healthy Minds, Thriving Kids, our project across California, entails instructional content around breathing exercises and a link to other breathing exercises you can teach with kids. You can also find all kinds of these all over YouTube, ranging in length from 1 minute to 20, and on most of the premier mindfulness apps that you can find in the App Store. The next major skill we think about teaching at home is managing thoughts. It's that we want people to understand in general that your thoughts are connected to how you feel and how you behave, and that there are generally these predictable ways that humans fall into thinking traps. And these are easily Googleable, but some of the common thinking traps that mental health practitioners highlight are often like kind of all or nothing thinking, or thinking very negatively about the future, or labeling yourself. I got a bad grade on the math test. That means I'm stupid. It could also mean you just forgot to study one of the particular sections, and you can plan for the next study session, for the next math test. It doesn't mean you're dumb. But it's that we know that as humans, we often fall into these thinking traps. We assume what other people are thinking about us. So we assume something about ourselves. We assume something about the future. And to be able to stop ourselves is a real skill. To say, wait a second, even though it feels like my internal monologue is fact, the first thought that I've had may not be the most realistic. I might be able to modify these thoughts. And what does that process look like? So a lot of what we're trying to teach kids is to stop in the moment and say, okay, let's make this thought a hypothesis. You've had this thought that this is exactly what's going on with your best friend, but let's just have that as one hypothesis. Is there any possibility that other stuff is happening? You know what? Let's consider your past experiences with your friend. Given all your past experiences, is it likely they think or feel the way that you're expecting right now? Is their recent behavior indicative they might feel this way? Is it possible they haven't decided to abandon you as a friend, but really they're just mad at you about a single thing? Maybe we can think about that. Is there a reason we might check in with them rather than assume that your best friend wants to abandon you forever? It's all these things where all we're trying to do is get kids to play around with their interpretation of a situation. And then when they come up with more accurate or helpful thoughts, what we try to do with them is re-summarize what these hypotheses might be with a little bit more, kind of options. Sense that, okay, so what we've decided is that while it's possibly true your best friend could be thinking this, it's also true your best friend could be thinking this or this. How could we figure out what the real truth is? And then we try to problem solve that way with kids as much as we can. It can start early, and at the same time, teenagers will still give you small openings to be able to practice those kinds of strategies. And again, one of the things that we have in some of the curricula that we've created, the articles we've created online, the content we feature, is teenagers talking in interviews about how they use these processes. So it isn't just us as adults telling teenagers that this is a useful strategy, but rather having them hear it from the mouths of people like them. The next thing, and as I talked about this, it's one of the core skills when people are feeling down or stressed. It's that no matter what stressors we're experiencing, if we are better at identifying our emotions and tracking them throughout the day, and we have this idea that we can possibly change our thought processes and think a little bit differently about the ways we're interpreting situations, and we're also focused on relaxation skills when we really need them, either ahead of situations we already know to be stressful. Like I might take deep breaths before a dinner with someone I know is a lot for me. One of the best ways to pull ourselves out of moments where we're feeling down, and we often have to drag teenagers to this as well, when we know that they're feeling down or they're feeling lethargic or they seem to be losing interest in certain things, it's activity scheduling. It is one of the most fundamental aspects of the ways that we make humans well, is that we make it so that they list out things that could possibly improve their mood. And commonly when people are in a lull or a down mood, what your brain tells you is, the payoff for the effort is not worth it. That activity won't be as enjoyable as it will be, terrible for the amount of effort we have to go to actually do it. And that's often untrue. All we're trying to get is for people to be scientists about their own wellness. Your brain may be telling you that going to that social gathering is not going to result in that much of an improvement in your wellness. Well, let's test out that hypothesis. Your brain may be telling you that doing something for others is not going to make you feel happy. Let's test it out. Your brain may be telling you it's something you used to find fun, whether it's something that takes 5 minutes, like watching a skit on YouTube, or something that takes an hour, like taking a walk to your favorite location and looking out at the ocean. Whatever it might be, your brain may be telling you that's not a big payoff, but let's see how you feel afterwards. Let's get back in touch with your feelings once you try some of these things. So frequently what we'll do with people is we'll inventory all kinds of activities like those on this list that they really have at some point in their life found joy around. And then we'll say, all right, how can we make space for 1 or 2 of these things this week and just add them in kind of incremental ways, understanding that the world is full of the plans that we've made to engage in certain wellness behaviors, and the fact that as humans, we often fail, and that's okay, we're mortal. It's that we set exercise plans. We say, you know what, next week, I'm gonna start using my gym 3 times a week, and we don't go. We don't go at all. We use it 0 times. All we do is we pick up the pieces, we try not to shame ourselves, and we say, okay, what are the activities I'm going to try to commit to this week? What are the obstacles that I might find to those activities? How can I insert them at moments that are lulls? And I show this slide because what I want people to be thinking about is that if you schedule mood boosting activities, they decrease your overall stress level in the sense that you're more able to confront, the situations of the day. And this is common in like high pressure work situations where people will say, well, taking a vacation wouldn't actually be that great. And then they come back and they're like, actually, I'm more efficient at work because I took that time off. And it's that counterintuitive notion that we are actually better at doing things and better at being there for our family members or as caregivers if we take that time for our own wellness than we are if we just, burn the candle at both ends. We also think about with people, going back to that emotion tracking, is that if we know there's a particular trough in their day where they feel really down, how can we add in an activity, even a brief one, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, that we know is going to boost their mood at least a little bit and make it so they have a chance to kind of decrease their overall stress level throughout the day. So the last couple of skills I'll talk about, because we're moving toward the question and answer portion, are first, distress tolerance skills. One of the criticisms of psychology over the course of the last decade has been the feeling that everything can be active, that basically if you have certain emotions you find displeasing, that there is this reputation that psychology has for saying, well, here's what you can do to fix that or to decrease that feeling. When the reality is that oftentimes we can't. We're just going to feel that feeling. We're going to need to tolerate that distress. We may not be able to change it in the moment. And when that serenity prayer situation is occurring, we want to make sure we have skills to say, we may not feel better, but here's how we're going to ride that wave. So because these big emotions create these urges to react, to lash out at a partner, to start yelling at kids, to start taking away everything that we know of for a teenager, it's how do we get ourselves and our kids to practice skills that help us ride that out. I don't know that I can make you feel better in this moment. But what I know is that if we think about, stopping for a moment and chatting, if we try to use milder words to describe a situation, if we decide that we're going to take a break from feeling this feeling by doing another activity that we know leads to another feeling, maybe that feeling will decrease. If we try one of our relaxation skills, if we try moving around, if we maybe try to come up with a less judgmental thought about ourselves, or what we do often with young kids in these situations is we create a sensory kit. We say, look, let's grab a lunchbox size thing and let's put in it something you want to look at, something you want to smell, something that you'd like to touch. And we'll say, if you're feeling big feelings, this may not be able to make that big feeling go away, but you can at least go back to it as kind of an anchor point for riding out that wave and for knowing that, you are trying to tolerate that distress without engaging in something that could be impulsive or reactive or kind of less helpful. Last thing I'll talk about is mindfulness. So all too often, mindfulness and relaxation skills are kind of lumped together. It's that relaxation skills tend to mean situations where you feel tense or stressed, and you're using something to try to decrease that tension or lessen that stress. Mindfulness is actually a state of paying attention to the present moment that isn't necessarily linked to how much stress you're feeling or wanting to decrease that stress. It's more about a state of existence. It's that in this moment, I am looking at a desk where I have an iced espresso that I particularly enjoy, that I don't really need this late in the afternoon because I'm on the East Coast. But if I wanted to, in the midst of this talk, even while I feel pressure to make sure I get to questions, I can take my espresso. I can take a moment and I can just taste the bitterness on my lips that I really like and be mindfully present in that. Or I can be mindfully present for a moment with the fact that there's over 60 of you thinking about how to promote wellness within your own families, within yourselves. And that represents a massive investment in the span of 1 hour in, likely a few hundred people's wellness. And that's wonderful. We should take a moment to appreciate that. So a lot of mindfulness is more about trying to bring someone back to the moment, not focusing on the future or the past, letting go of thoughts that might occur to them about what they absolutely need to do in the next moment, or what they need to take care of, or self-judgmental thinking, and just trying to be in this moment. Feel how your body feels in this moment. Feel how you're sitting. Notice what's around you while you're walking. Bringing mindfulness to everyday activities, talking with a family member, being with a child. I spend much of my weekend, because I so love my work and I think about it all the time, I spend much of my weekend with my 5-year-old and my 2-year-old telling myself, leave your phone in the other room. Be with the Legos at this time. Be doing paint. Be outside thinking about the fact the weather has gotten warmer with them and thinking about what cool things we could do in collecting some stuff in nature. And if I can bring myself to that even for a few minutes every day, I know I'm vastly improving the quality of my interactions and the wellness of those around me, and really my own wellness, because the fact is I'm better for my work when I think about myself at least a little bit. So that's the last thing I'll say before questions, is that when we talk about these skills, I've gone through a lot of them today. It's that in the midst of a pandemic that still has an uncertain way of kind of untangling itself and uncertain ways that we're going to reconstruct the world as we know it, we can go back to bedrock concepts of wellness and coping within families, of thinking about our routines, how we sleep, how we eat, how we hydrate, how we exercise, how we spend time around screens. We can go back to promoting coping skills that may or may not be there, identifying our feelings, engaging in relaxation, tolerating big emotions, scheduling in mood-boosting activities, understanding our thoughts are like clay and we can shape them, and trying to be more mindful in activities. But the only way we do this well for our family members, for our colleagues, for our partners, for those around us, is if to some degree we put the oxygen mask on ourselves. And too often in our society, it's thought of as indulgent for adults to do this. That like at some level, if you're trying to meditate or do yoga, oh my gosh, you're taking too much time for yourself, you're indulging, and why aren't you with your children? And the reality is if we don't take at least a little bit of that time, it's very likely that we and those around us are less well. So in that sense, what I would encourage all of you to do is to think from something like today, where I've presented a lot of concepts all at once, schedule your own self-care. Assess the barriers you might have to engaging those rituals yourself, to taking even 5 minutes for yourself in any given day, and to applying some of these skills both for you and your family members. So with that, let us move to questions. Charlene, I believe you're coming in to moderate. Hello.
I'm here. Thank you, Dave Anderson, for all the brilliant advice. My head and my heart are just bursting with ideas on how to help our kids, and also not more importantly, but also importantly, to help ourselves. So thank you for all that wonderful advice. People really have been weighing in on the chat on how terrific this was. And again, this talk will have a ripple effect. And we know that, yeah.
I'm seeing the numbers tick up in the chat, and I'm telling myself, I don't need to look at it because I'm going to ride the wave of how Charlene's going to moderate it. So
exactly. We are going to reduce your stress now, because I know, boy, you had that down to the minute, Dr. Anderson. Okay.
I want to make sure we give the people what they want, and it looked like there were some questions. Let's do it.
All right, here we go. Good question from Gail. How do I know if my child is getting enough sleep? If they're waking up on their own, that is without an alarm, can I assume they're getting enough sleep? It's hard to tell just by how cranky or sleepy they are.
Right. So, waking up by themselves isn't always the best indicator, because kids could be woken up by street noise. They could be woken up by people walking around the house. They could be woken up by the light outside. And that doesn't necessarily, mean that they're getting a ton of sleep. Oftentimes what we look at with parents is we'll say, let's gather some data. Let's look at the entire kind of, landscape of their sleep. How much do they sleep on weekends, when they have the chance to sleep in, or they might not have things in the morning? What time do they tend to go to bed there? Because frequently, if a kid is sleeping in more on the weekends, but they're waking up really early, say on a weekday, we might say, well, we might need to push their bedtime back gradually, because it's perhaps the excitement of school or the pressure of it that's waking them up a little bit early or something like that. But a lot of times, we're just looking at sort of that data where we'll say how many, what's the number of hours that a kid might have gotten. And then we'll look at crankiness. And if crankiness is uniformly there above or below a certain threshold, we're like, okay, they're not getting enough sleep. But if they're cranky only sometimes, and it doesn't seem to be too, linked to sleep, maybe we decide that's just sort of something that we might not be able to predict, and they're likely getting enough rest. But again, it's kind of looking at it on the whole.
Thank you, Dave. Great advice. Okay, here's one. If you could solve this, there'd be a lot of grateful parents. Sure. Question. My teenage girls want to have tattoos and nose piercing. I don't know how to deal with these requests. That is, I don't know if this is their way to cope with high school stress or peer pressure. Any advice?
Well, I'll start off my first reaction to that, which is not the first time I've gotten that question from parents. All I'll say is most piercings are reversible, especially the initial ones, and tattoos are not. Just gonna throw it out there, not as easily reversible, involve a lot. Other than that, and without kind of joking about it, it's that, what we're trying to figure out with teenagers is how they can engage in authentic self-expression. But at the same time, we as parents are thinking about that authentic self-expression, and then also what that means for how they present themselves to the world and our wishes for their future. Because the most common thing we hear from parents around that is, well, if they get tattoos or if they get piercings, and then I'm trying to get them to a career, post high school or something like that, how will they be viewed in these work environments if they present as something counterculture or something that looks like it's, sort of in your face related to identity. And again, with most parents, we say, like, there are some households where this is an absolute no-go, where the parents say, look, this is our house, this is our beliefs. When you're 18, when you're an adult, you can start thinking about decisions around this, but not under our roof, that kind of thing. If you're willing to consider this as an area of self-expression, what we're often trying to get teachers to think about is like, what is it about this, about how they want to express themselves? Are there ways to experiment with more impermanent methods of self-expression? Like, for example, what often goes alongside tattoos and piercings is dyed hair or things like that, or cool nail polish. Are there ways to do that that are a little bit easier to reverse? And then finally, if we're really open to it, it's really thinking about the permanence with that child, and also thinking about how you work up to it. You don't just go and get a tattoo on a Saturday. You spend a few months sitting with the decision and really thinking about what this means and whether or not this sticks. I always tell teenagers that, my reaction to this is that when I was 18, I think about the ideas that I had for tattoos I would have gotten. They would not have stood the test of time. At this age, I would have thought those tattoos were dumb. So we want to make sure that these are very carefully considered decisions rather than impulsive decisions of self-expression and emotional sturm and drang. That's what I'll.
Well, that is really great advice, especially when you look at this last quote here. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. That's a great California metaphor, Dave Anderson.
They're going to learn to express themselves regardless of what guardrails we put in place. It's just a question of whether or not we can help them to explore critical questions.
Exactly. And, in taking the long view, I recently held my 14-day-old granddaughter in my arms, and you think, I'm so proud of my son to get to that point, but it had to do with a lot of long view parenting, as you said.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Okay. You talked about helping kids identify emotions. Here's a parent with a good question. Mm-hmm. She asks, my husband is old school and doesn't talk about thoughts and feelings like I'd like to. We have children who are 2, 5, and 8. What are some wellness ideas for creating a culture of labeling our emotions, even if we weren't raised that way?
Right. So, I think for people who were raised in families that weren't too big on emotional discussion or weren't too big on identifying and labeling their emotions, what I get back to is helping parents to think of their common goals. So frequently what I'll do with two parents who are kind of raised differently is I'll try to ask them what their goals are for the kids. And usually those are fairly well aligned. We want them to have healthy relationships, we want them to get along with the people they live with, we want them to find love, we want them to graduate school. And what I'll often say is people can accomplish all of those goals coming from families that don't have a lot of emotional dialogue. But the reality is if you're putting down bets for people who are going to be able to effectively manage all the relationships in their lifetimes, emotional literacy is the bet I would place. And so what I try to get people to think about is odds. And it's not so much about changing your own behavior. Sometimes with parents who aren't used to talking about feelings, all I'm looking for is them to be open to their kids talking about them. So even with somebody who isn't necessarily sharing their own, if a child then shares feelings with them, can we say, hey, I hear you? Or man, that sounds like a rough situation with your friend. Or I hear you, you're sad that we're not having fish sticks tonight. It's like, how can you just hear that emotional expression and value it, even if maybe your kids don't see you as being so above the surface and being so revealing. But it's those little steps that you're trying to get your partner to engage in, where you're saying, look, what small steps can we take to make it so that our kids see that we're open to this, even if it doesn't mean changing who we are at our core?
That's right. Perhaps something like sharing that behavior gradation chart of feelings and just posting that on the fridge so that you and the kids can talk about it.
Completely, because it may be that the kid asks the parent who isn't used to talking about feelings, what is this?
Yeah.
And all you want that parent to have is a sentence to say, well, I noticed that all over your school, there's a lot of things about, feelings. And if you're having feelings in a moment, we can look at this. And that's basically all they're going to say. And the kid might walk into the kitchen the next time and point to something. And the parent can just say, oh, okay, you're telling me you're feeling this way.
There you go. My dad is from the silent generation after World War II, and he didn't say, I love you, but he showed it to his kids every day.
Sure. And that's beautiful.
All right, Dave, we have talked about a lot of things today, and we've all been through a lot with this pandemic. Parents, caregivers, educators. With all of that, what gives you hope today?
What gives me hope, I think, and this is really related to my work now, which is that I think that we have a lot of people who are looking to solve complex problems. So in that sense, what I get jazzed by a lot of the day in my work is that, I see people who are trying to say, look, we had difficulties before the pandemic in child and adolescent mental health. We know that we have difficulties now, but we also know a lot of the solutions. It's just about how do we break down the stigma around them and how do we make it so that people have more access to them. So the more that we get messaging like this out, the more that we can decrease the stigma of this kind of practice in families, the more likely I am to feel hope for the future that, we'll see fewer people suffering and that we'll also be able to increase access and increase the willingness of people to seek help when they need it. Because, our general, orientation to work as mental health professionals is just to try to figure out how we can help people cope with stress. That's why most of us get into the career.
Exactly. Well, those are beautiful words to end on. Dr. Dave Anderson from Child Mind Institute. We want to thank you so much for being with us today. We are truly honored. And all of you who joined us, again, you're just being here today is making things better for your children and teens. So do give yourself a nice pat on the back also for joining us. And big thanks to you, Dave Anderson. Take care, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and hope to see you soon. Goodbye, everybody.